Hello everyone, and welcome again to FLOSS, our course on open source software. In this session we will look at the processes and practices of open source project communities. And for this we will look at the structure of projects, the roles people play and the career path they can have. And then we look at what I call the 3-4-5 model of open communities, open project communities, which are the principles of three principles of open collaboration, 4 practices of open communication, and 5 stages of open source volunteering. As mentioned in the beginning of this course, open source is highly innovative, meaning in this case on the domain or in the aspects of process innovation, open source community processes are quite different from what we are used to, say, from within companies. So open source has brought us new processes of collaboration, and here specifically of community-based project collaboration. It helps to contrast this to make sure we understand how this is different, and we'll deepen that understanding about how it's different in the first step from what happens within firms. So within a firm, you have a project structure such that the firm, the company, owns the project and the intellectual property with it, and also can fully determine any project structures. It's the firm or the CEO of the firm ultimately who determines how things work. Inside an open source project, or for an open source project, it's the community which owns the software by way of a license, and a community which decides on how the project is conducted. And a community is not a legal entity, so it is a group of people that collaborates, and where decision making and all of that is the result of sort of consensus building process. And that's very different from companies. So in this session, we will be talking about community open source projects. Again, projects owned and run by a community. I'm saying this because later it will become apparent that open source could also not be community oriented. So we will distinguish between commercial and community open source. It's not quite accurate to say commercial here, but we'll see the differences in later sessions. But for that purpose, commercial open source projects are those controlled by a company. Hence there's that one legal entity controlling the software and the project. And examples are the Sugar CRM software for customer relationship management, or the Linux distribution, Red Hat Enterprise Linux distribution, which is controlled by Red Hat. As opposed to that, there are community softwares, projects like the Linux kernel, which is solely community-based, or the Debian distribution. Also, I made a distinction here already in that there can be very different types of open source projects by structure. And I made a distinction here between single components or applications, or whole distributions where the community puts together some of the or all of the many different pieces and makes it work together. That's a distribution. All right, so let's talk now about how open source project communities function. Here is a classic model of the different roles that people play, and also what power this gives them within a project. So you could have someone simply reading up on a project, number one here, using the software but not saying anything, being a passive user, then perhaps becoming a bug reporter by reporting a bug, maybe as a developer, becoming a bug fixer, then making the occasional episodic or peripheral contribution as a peripheral developer here, or becoming an active regular contributor, finally becoming a co-member or a project leader. This model is called the onion model because it's not only a set of roles that people can play, but it also suggests that there's a succession or a project immigration model going on here, where you have to take on these roles and steps. Now, I've color-coded these rings or of the onion, if you will, already into 3 main categories, which is a simplification, but a good enough one, where we can see that we distinguish between people using the software, people contributing to the software, and people leading the software, also being called a committer, the project. So that actually is simplifying, leads to the basic career path that someone can have in an open source project. They start out as a user. They might make a contribution to the project, and that if that contribution gets accepted, they're implicitly promoted to become a contributor to that project, can call themselves that, sometimes also simply called developer. And if they do so regularly and in a sustained and quality way, then they might be appointed by the existing committers and project leaders to become a core member or committer of the project. And that is usually an explicit promotion. A committer is someone who has change rights to the software project, and a contributor does not have change rights. So a contributor submits to core members or committers any suggested change, where it gets reviewed and put into action, meaning the code repository, by the committer, only if it's considered a good contribution. So contributors depend on committers, and there's implied a review process, which is also a critical part of the quality assurance in open source projects. Everyone can become a contributor by simply making a contribution. Becoming a committer is a much more important event, and while you implicitly become a contributor, becoming a committer is typically something that will be announced with quite some fanfare on the mailing lists of the project or whatever way the project communicates. Committers are important because they lead the direction of the project. There may be a dedicated project leader, or it may be a circle of or a group of equal peers that are committers and consensually lead the project. All of that are variants found in open source projects. Now, this is the basic simplified model, also the onion model, but the emergence of open source software foundations has led to a more elaborate one. So after this basic career, you can have extended, or software developers can have an extended open source career, where the projects, now part of an open source foundation, are managed ultimately by, or are governed by the open source foundation and its rules. So the open source foundations have set up a project management committee membership. So there's a project management committee which has members and a leader, and these and the PMC, the project management committee, is responsible for ultimately managing the direction of a particular component or open source project. This goes beyond what a committer does, who has write rights, change rights to the code repository or relevant artifacts. This is really now about the strategic leadership of some open source project. And in fact, the reasons why open source foundations exist, and we'll see that in a later session, is to make economically important open source projects long-term viable, to give them a home, to make them sustainable. But an open source foundation can host many projects of high economic significance. And so there's usually one step more possible beyond being the leader of a project management committee. That would only be one project, one component. And you could become a director or a member of the foundation. There are different stages of how natural people can become members of a foundation and exert influence beyond a single project that they are on. So that's the extended career path. What it means for software developers and in terms of the career, we will also look at a later session on labor economics. So this is now an extension of the onion model, which did not include anything about a career beyond a single project, as illustrated here, a career as part of an open source foundation. And as indicated, open source foundations are the home for the economically important open source projects, that is the platforms that we all build on. Here you can see the full path. It's really a 6-step, if you will, 6 stages or 6-step career model. Usually developers can't jump any of these steps. They take them one after another. Now, beyond this career, we have to look at how people work with each other inside open source projects. And many projects have found ways of describing it. Perhaps the most prominent one is the Apache Way, a codification, one would hope, of how the Apache Software Foundation works and how its project work. And if you go to the website, you will find this as the description of the Apache Way, that it's going to be collaborative software development, that they are friendly to commercial use of the software they develop, high quality, security, etc. So it's a little bit of a, it's important criteria, but it's a little bit of a laundry list. Here is another way of looking at it. This is the interpretation or explanation of the Apache Way by one of its members, Shane Kuru, and he tried to explain the Apache Way using these 4, 5, 6 aspects of it. And while helpful to mention all of this, it's not really practical in that it guides you. And to my academic mind, it's also, again, a little bit of a laundry list. So these are things that simply don't belong in the same category here. So category error. For that reason, I developed this simple 3-4-5 model of open project communities, where we characterize open projects and the communities using the 3 principles of open collaboration, the 4 practices of open communication, and the 5 stages of project volunteering. It's also a simplification, but it's easy to remember. So then, the 3 principles of open collaboration, already mentioned in earlier lectures, are that collaboration is egalitarian, meritocratic, and self-organizing. Here you can see it compared to traditional work, typically inside companies, where traditional work is hierarchical, and hence you're somewhere in the hierarchy, and that determines what you can see and what you get access to. Open collaboration is egalitarian. It does not exclude anyone. Anyone can contribute. We are all on equal footing and will not be a priori excluded from projects. Decision-making in companies is usually status-oriented, with higher status winning who gets to make a decision. And in open source, its decisions are based on the merits of the argument, meaning the better argument ultimately wins. If that was not the case, people would leave the project because they feel that they are not taken serious. Meritocracy is also what the Apache Software Foundation says it is based on. Here I frame it a bit more narrowly as the key of how decisions are made. In companies, then, as part of the hierarchy, not only are you limited in what you can see, you are also in a prescribed situation. You get tasks assigned, you get allocated to a project. There is no choice for you what process to follow as you develop software. Now, in open collaboration projects, that is different because these are self-organizing projects. People choose the processes, choose their project, they self-organize. That is quite the difference, stark difference to companies who want developers to be more like cogs in a machine so that no project depends too much on a particular person. Open collaboration projects, open source projects try to work with the strength of individual people such that they can get the most out of those who are willing to contribute to a project. So we have these three principles of egalitarian, everyone can contribute, meritocratic, decisions are based on the merits of the argument, and self-organization, people organize and determine their own processes, which really make open source projects tick the way they do. And the reason why I'm not giving you here as a process or a workflow of open source projects is because there is no such thing. The best we can do is come up with these principles from our analyses of open source projects to tell you how these are similar and what makes the category of open source software projects. In addition to collaboration, collaboration is a necessity based on communication, which in the case of open source projects has to be open communication. And it's only good open communication if that communication is public, not hidden behind doors. It's written, typically by email or sometimes also in forums, and it's complete. So you're not hiding anything because that public written communication has to be the complete record of what's of relevance. And if it's not been written down in email and made public, it has not been said. That's how the saying goes. And then finally, it will always get archived. So this is also in stark contrast to how companies work, because first of all, in companies, communication is not public. It's behind the company doors and sometimes locked down within a project. Often it's not written because nobody wants to be exposed to what they have said in the past because they might want to change their opinion. It's often not complete, maybe hidden agendas, and certainly it's not archived because again people don't want to have their feet held to fire if they have to change their opinion. Anyway, so let's walk through that a little bit, what it means for open source projects. So public communication is communication that's visible to everyone, and thereby it creates trust and credibility. So everyone can join, everyone can participate, and you usually do that on mailing lists, and you avoid private emails and certainly don't use the phone, etc. If you have to do something in private, you typically summarize it then and put it in writing to the mailing list. Written, again, communication means it increases the reach of communication. First of all, you reach people who aren't there when you were communicating otherwise, and that helps if people aren't in the same room or in the same time zone, etc., etc. Also, for non-native speakers, it really makes it easier to slowly sometimes read what's been said and try to understand an ongoing conversation. Such written communication creates transparency combined with archiving, traceability, and history. It really makes communication easier and helps create that trust that makes people want to join because the project is honest and open. Writing emails is actually surprisingly hard. We will look at that a little bit later again. Here are some very basic practices, like email should have one purpose, and if you have multiple things, put them into different emails so that the subject line actually is descriptive of the email. Then there are debatable practices, top quoting, bottom quoting, etc. Things like that to consider. Third, communication, open communication in projects, open source projects should be complete. So if it's complete, again, everyone can participate, and also it really helps people who are new to the project to more easily get up to speed. And again, this way it creates more trust and credibility. And finally, open source communication or open communication is archived. That has some practical benefits like an immediate documentation of what has been going on. But also it actually disciplines communication. If you know what you're saying or writing to a mailing list, will be archived forever. You will be rather low-key on offending people, and you will be focused on the content of the arguments rather than offending other people. So that increased discipline creates more trust and credibility for the projects. This way, actually, open source projects found a way to document themselves. Everyone knows how hard and how poor the documentation of almost all software projects is, open source or not. And by requiring written and archived, public, complete written, archived document communication, open source projects literally document themselves, because all important decisions need to go through the mailing list typically and will be archived. And the discipline of such communication means that at the end of some discussion, when a decision is being made, there will be a summary email, or the person asking and making ultimately the final summary has to make a summary of that decision, and it will go into the mailing list archive, and thereby there is now a documented thread with a conclusion as to why a particular decision was cast. This is a good way of self-documenting, which actually happens in the act, and thereby is helpful to the engineers, to the developers, as they go about their daily business, which is so much better than trying to document things after the fact, and you actually have no incentive or no motivation to do that documentation. So open source projects in some sense cracked a key aspect of good documentation that usually is something that developers don't like to do. And again, communication is so important. There are lots and lots of practices to follow. Here I think from the Vogel book and or some others. And we will look at some of those later as well. Now, after open collaboration, the 3 principles of open collaboration and the 4 practices of open communication, the 5 stages of volunteering. Here is Behlendorf's model of project immigration, and he sees, or he argues, that it's this incremental stepwise engagement of users and developers with a project where they have some initial need or urge or problem they're trying to fix, and then they escalate in stages until potentially in the end they become a leader of the project. So as part of solving their own problem, they engage with the project, build rapport, fall in love with the project or not, or simply start contributing all the way to potentially leading the project. Now I will recast that as the 5 stages of open source volunteering to make it much simpler. And we will describe these. I will describe these 5 stages using the best practices that are being applied as part of these 5 stages, where a best practice is basically a broadly accepted, often informally defined method for achieving something, doing something. And yeah, so we should have seen here here we go. Our 5 stages of open source volunteering, and here you can see those 5 stages. What's noteworthy is that it takes a dual or complementary view of the volunteer as a broad brush stroke role here, and the project view. And we can see how a volunteer goes through the 5 stages of finding a project for that problem, understanding the project, engaging with the project, working with the project, and finally becoming a leader of the project themselves. and the project view, where the project needs or wants to find volunteers and work with them. So the project view for each of these stages of the volunteer needs to be available to them, first by marketing the project, explaining the project, engaging with a volunteer, working with a contributor, and then enabling a career as a project leader. So these 5 stages we will look at in detail. So here is stage 1 for the volunteer. From the volunteer's perspective, they want to find a project. So they have that itch, they have that problem, and they want to find a matching project. And the 2 best practices, if you will, are that they simply, by lucky chance, stumble on the project. So that's just lucky chance, or maybe they hear about it. Or because they deliberately want to fix or solve their problem, they actively search for it using some search engine. So this is simply things that volunteers do, not necessarily with the goal in mind of joining the project, just with the goal of fixing their particular problem. Now, for this to work, the project and the project leaders behind it, or the current team of the software, of the open source project, needs to make that possible. So it needs to enable stumbling upon the project. It needs to make the project findable through general or domain-specific search engines. So the project for that needs to be prepared to be found. It needs to perform active outreach, which has basic best practices like having a good name, understanding the channels or the ways of how volunteers find the project and being active on those channels, etc. So here are a couple of channels of how projects may market themselves. There's the basic website for the project that can get picked up by search engines. So search engine optimization plays a role. Then projects can put up large projects, important projects, can show up at conferences where they present themselves, or in the case of foundations, even have their own conferences. Such projects may announce anything they have to say, not only on their own channels, like their own mailing lists, but going through established channels like Hacker News or Reddit, so priming those, or using Twitter, etc. So this is literally marketing channels as we know it, and open source projects have to do that too. So a project needs to be active about marketing it, and it also needs to deal with the potential inflow now of interested parties, and that's a passive inflow where again they need to register themselves so that they can be found, register themselves on all relevant places. So such relevant places are basically portals like Olo or the Open Hub, the former Olo, and some others. Many of these portals these days are actually defunct, so they were not particularly strong, didn't have a good business model, but say GitHub would fall into this as well, even if you're not actually doing GitHub development on GitHub. So we will look at tooling later on, how open source innovation also applied to software tooling. Let me just say here that software forges are a tool invention by the open source community at large, and that these forges support this particular process of A, marketing outreach, and B, accepting or being prepared for passive inflow. And we'll see that later. So then, in a second step, the volunteer who somehow now found a project they are interested in, either out of curiosity or because it solves or fixes a particular problem for them. The volunteer finds a project. That in itself does not mean much, because now the volunteer is staring at some website and needs to understand the project. So they want to read up on it. That's their goal. For that to work, the project needs to explain itself. How to do that right is again a set of best practices. For example, to have a clear mission statement that explains what the project is about. It needs to provide examples and screenshots to create some intuition. State the license and the terms of the project. Make it simple to download things, etc., etc. Simply making it easy, really easy, to the potential volunteer, the visitor perhaps only at this stage, to learn what the project is all about, so that the visitor can potentially become a volunteer. Well, first of all, just perhaps a user and then a volunteer. For volunteering, of course, the project needs to state its rules of engagement, which is part of explaining how that particular project community works. Here you can see a project homepage where you can see the name, the license, some social aspects of it, how it's been ranked or rated, screenshots, making it really easy to download the software, etc. Alright, so the volunteer now wants to engage with the project. So they found a project and they read up on it, and so they like what they see and use or want to use the project. If the project was set up properly, then using the software shouldn't be too hard. But maybe there are things that are not easily done or not that well explained, so it might be that the volunteer has to ask a question about how to use the software. For that, the volunteer can of course just ask that question, but a good volunteer will actually do their homework first and communicate well how will communicate well what the problem is, and we'll look at that in a second. So for that, the reason why a volunteer cannot just barge in, demand attention and be satisfied is, why would they? Why would the project help the potential volunteer? They have no incentive unless they really believe that person will be helpful to the project later on. In the beginning, they're really just a distraction. And in fact, as we'll see in a bit, most people who ask questions will just consume time and effort, and there won't be any payback for the project. So a volunteer or a smart person who wants to ask questions about the project does so in a way that it indicates they are honest and open and put in some legwork themselves and are not just stealing the existing developer's time. So for that, the volunteer obviously needed to browse around the website, typically, understand a little bit about the practices, for example, where and how to ask a question, and be willing to accept any guidance as they ask the question, for example. So here's a typical way of doing that. I just picked it from a random open source project. Someone is asking a question. They have a problem with using the software. It's the typical request for help. As you can see, that person grovels a little bit. Well, not grovels, but points out, okay, I'm here for the first time. Please forgive me if I'm making a mistake. But then actually follows a reasonable email. It's first of all description, so it's clear. They have a problem. It's clear from the subject line. Then they say, okay, I'm here for the first time. Then they describe the situation, and then they describe the problem with the situation in a descriptive, positive way. They simply say what the setup is and then what they do and the outcome they get from it and why it's not the expected outcome. There's no complaining here, for example, how crappy the software is that it leads to a problem. Obviously, that would be would lead the questioner, the person asking the question, to being ignored immediately. So this is a reasonable email asking for help. And asking questions is really not that easy. Well, it is easy once you know how to do it, but if you've struggled with a problem for too long, you're easily tempted to not write a good question. So at that time, you need to take a step back and ask, maybe cool down, and then ask the question properly. So here's a simple way how to ask a question, suggested by my one reader of our work, and he said, like, you should first say what you want. I would like to do X. Then what you tried to achieve that. That already might be an indicator to a reader that you're trying the wrong thing, perhaps. And then what happened, and perhaps why it's not the thing you expected to happen. In addition, since usually this is some sort of debugging going on through a mailing list, make sure that you include all relevant information, what operating system you're running, the versions, etc., etc. This guy also says no attachments. That's not a good thing for the typical open source mailing lists, and really make it short. Long emails usually don't get read, TLDR, as you probably know. Here's another article from the web by Raymond and Moen on how to ask questions the smart way. This collection of advice is interesting in that it's rather rude, as the open source communities sometimes in their communication, not all, can be quite rude. And you can see how it's very detail oriented, but practical advice. I'm not going into every little aspect of this here. You can read it up. Just go to the literature section of the course, look up RM14, and read up on some of this advice if you like to. So communication on mailing lists is so important that some foundations or projects have literally set up etiquette for how to act properly, all the way down to how to format subjects, how to format the emails, all the way to styles of writing, the well-known etiquette. This doesn't actually begin and end with open source projects. Really all open collaboration projects are like that. Here is advice from the former executive director of the Wikimedia Foundation, Sue Gardner, on how to communicate with a community or within a community. And this advice is actually very good advice. And you can read up under the reference G16 about it too. So then back to stage 3, where we are engaging with a volunteer. This is the project perspective. So there is now that visitor or potential volunteer, and they ask a question perhaps. So how do you engage with that person? First of all, you need to make it possible that the person asks that question. So you make clear or explicit how they can ask questions, how you can be reached, what is the appropriate mailing list or the appropriate forum. Since the goal is to acquire people as volunteers, you need to make them feel at home. So you might want to welcome them. If they register for a project, maybe they have a person-specific website, leave a small note there, like the Wikipedia community does. Leave a small note there welcoming that person to the community. In general, don't be rude, which is a particular challenge for open source projects, which are based on which are not necessarily strong on social graces. Just look at the RM14 example from earlier. And the general aspects of open communication apply, avoid private discussions, etc., etc. Still, you will have to accept some redundancy. So if someone asks the same question that others have asked, don't be rude, like RTFM them, tell them to simply plainly and friendly point them to the mailing list archives where maybe their question has been answered before. Since you're also thinking about potentially acquiring volunteers, not only might you answer their questions, you should also make very visible, simple, basic tasks that someone could pick up who is grateful for having received good answers, for example, to their problem, to make a contribution to the project. So basic practices on how to pull people on board. So since there are different volunteers, potential volunteers or contributors, there might be the non-technical person who could help with marketing and bug reports. There are also, of course, there are the technical people, developers. So for those technical people, you need extra best practices. You need to provide tool access for them. To them, you may give them some access rights to the bug tracker, so to file a bug if you didn't make it public from the get-go. You'll show them the project roadmap and the requirements, etc., etc. And certainly you need to provide some documentation, even if it's just a wiki with the links into the main decisions as derived in communication on a mailing list. Okay, so the project is preparing itself to potentially acquire volunteers, but that is hard. There's quite a gap between asking a question and becoming someone who spends their time on helping a project. So in order to motivate people, one needs to understand their motivations. There's a fair bit of research out there why people participate in open source projects. Here's a collection of the key motivations. There's the original technical motivation. The person has a problem, is looking for a solution in the form of software typically. There is economic motivation, at least hypothesized economic motivation, where developers signal their capabilities to the labor market for future employment perhaps. So they simply show how capable they are. And as we'll also see later, a subset of developers, smart developers, see open source work as a career path for a stronger economic negotiation position with their employers as well. The social motivation might, though, beyond the technical motivation, be the most important one. People like working in communities if they feel valued, if they think their contributions make a difference. So some people feel validated, feel good about being in a community, simply enjoy the work with other people they like. And that is what you need to utilize, or what a project needs to utilize to get to that first contribution. That's the first major hurdle. How do you get someone to spend their personal time typically to contribute to a project? So the most basic thing to get right is to make it easy to make a first contribution. Make the bug tracker open. So if someone wants to file a bug, then they shouldn't have to ask an unknown person to get access to the bug tracker. Simply allow people to file bugs, period. Make it open, available for everyone. Then, as you perhaps lay out in a document the roadmap of the project, there should be simple tasks, as mentioned already, but also make these contributions or simple tasks incremental in that they build on each other and people can go from smaller to larger contributions. So this way, anyone who has time to spare, who thinks this project might be good for them and wants to contribute, finds it easy to contribute. In addition to bringing those on board who by themselves do it, a project leader, the project, might also call out lurkers from the shadows. So you can actively on the mailing list ask for help by pointing out that simple tasks need to be done and whether there wouldn't be anyone who's been benefiting from the project and likes the project, and that's maybe why they're on the mailing list, but hasn't done anything yet. So you call them out from the shadows, the so-called lurkers, you call them out, and maybe that's how they get to make their first contribution. So again, forges make it really easy to support that. It's how the tooling of open source software development supports the processes, in particular the engineering aspects of the processes, to make that open collaboration happen easily and smoothly. The volunteer, let's assume they've made their first contribution and a second or a third contribution, and maybe they are a so-called peripheral or episodic volunteer, or maybe they are a regular volunteer now. They just have fun. Maybe it's in spare time, maybe it's actually paid time. To be a good volunteer, you need to be responsive and reliable as you contribute. As you contribute, that's of course the essential aspect. If you don't, you fall by the wayside and will ultimately, again, then perhaps be ignored. The project or the project leaders really need to keep igniting that fire, or keep people motivated to contribute. And again, it means that the software or the project has to be structured in a way that it's easy to keep people involved, and there are various best practices to follow. One perhaps debatable question is that the project should have a component-oriented setup so that there is ownership and that it's clear who to ask. Not everyone will agree, because, say, agile development, which is more feature-oriented, will say, well, everyone can change everything, and we take a feature or function-oriented perspective. So open source will have to combine that. Historically, open source projects have always been component-oriented, mostly because, I believe, originally most open source projects have been distributed in nature. And if you're distributed, working in a distributed fashion, you simply divvy up work in such a way that people have clear responsibilities, and that's usually most easily done by aligning people's responsibilities with technical component boundaries. Nevertheless, in order to get work done and keep motivated work, keep people motivated, you should give them features, even if those features mean that the developer has to touch multiple components. As if that person, the developer here, is still a volunteer who is contributing but actually can't change the code base, they may have to touch different components and submit to the different component owners, the committers for those components, their particular suggested changes. That can be quite tricky because you need to coordinate these changes. Ideally, it's simple, and one person can enact all those changes, even if it requires review by different people. So here's a little bit of a distinction. The project wants to work with a new contributor, so someone making their first contribution. There is this little blip that this person who is making a contribution might be someone to be there longer time. You don't know. So you don't want to make life hard for them, as they are willing to spend some time. So very basic, react speedily. Thank them and react speedily to whatever contribution they are making. Certainly don't sit on, say, patches that they've been providing. That doesn't mean you need to be thankful in the sense of simply accepting anything that comes along. Quite the opposite. As a project leader or committer, you have a responsibility to maintain the quality, and effectively you actually need to guide any new contributor to make any contributions in the best possible way. That actually means you have to guide them, for example, to accept basic programming guidelines that the project has agreed to if they ignored those. Now, a good volunteer will have read up on the project and will have chosen the proper programming guidelines, but if they didn't, then it's got to be a back and forth and guidance by the project leaders that guides the new contributor to understand the ways of the project and adjust to that. For that reason, basically, contributions need to be turned into conversations between the contributor and the receiving committer, who engages with the contributor to make sure things fit. Small patches usually get in pretty easily. Large patches are a bad idea, so there are lots of best practices of how a smart contributor works with the project. For example, by first discussing what they want to do on the mailing list, basically then raising their hand that they're telling the world that they're going to do this, and then incrementally working on it and gathering feedback from the rest of the team. That's how you get larger changes into a project, because you don't suddenly surprise everyone with one large patch that is just too large to review. And again, project leaders who have the longevity and quality of the project in mind are more likely to reject any large patch, any large contribution that they can't quality assess, and rather than accept it. So contributions need to be high quality, otherwise they simply get rejected. Anyway, so again, going back to the project, as it is working with a new contributor, the project, the key developers, core committers, etc., they need to react speedily. They need to create communication and the contribution really into a conversation. They need to provide code review and feedback until the contribution is right. Usually it's not right from the get-go. They need to provide credit, so the developer, the new contributor, now a contributor, and the former user, now a new contributor, then a new contributor. Once their submission, their patch got accepted, they want to see credit. That makes them feel good. That creates that potential enjoyment of participating in the project, and etc. So this is a way of how you bring new contributors on board. Now, a new contributor will turn into a regular contributor over time. Although some will not, but some will. And those who become regular contributors, as a project leader, you have to track their interests. You can pull them out. You can assign to them perhaps some tasks, etc. There's a subtle shift going on here. A new contributor probably is making a contribution with respect to the thing that was their problem to begin with. So maybe the project solved their problem, but only 80%. So they programmed the missing 20% themselves. The initial connection with the project is almost always specific to the problem at hand, while any later engagement, if there is loyalty with the project, may well go beyond the specific problem they initially had to a broader support of the project. That is also not only how the project leaders come about, who we talk about, but simply how long-term volunteers come about who do things that are not necessarily fun and that don't necessarily fix their actual problem at hand, but are simply good and important for the project, like cleaning up a wiki, or sometimes going to a conference and marketing, being at a booth or marketing the project. Things like that that don't actually have much to do any longer with the original motivation to join the project. Anyway, so you work with a regular contributor, you track their interests and you try to meet their interests so that they have fun contributing. You also slowly start sharing with them not only technical work, but perhaps managerial work. And as you work with them, you demonstrate that as a project leader, you demonstrate that you're serious about it, which means you follow up. If they accepted a task, but nothing is happening, you follow up and you ask why nothing is happening. And if it all fails, that means you will have to a little bit embarrass them and pull out. So that's how it is. So you now have regular contributors and they should be participating in the meritocratic decision-making process of the project because they are capable. They are actively working on the project, so they have some understanding and they can make a contribution on the mailing lists as it pertains to perhaps some important software architecture decisions to be made. And there are lots and lots of best practices. Ideally, it's a discussion with a conclusion based on the merits of the argument, where everyone in the end agrees, yes, that's the best solution. And these discussions can be lengthy. You need to try to keep ego out and really make sure it's not about the egos of the people, sometimes not easy, but rather it's about the technical content of the question and the potential problem solution. Now, ideally, you achieve consensus. For people accustomed to the ways how companies do it, these discussions can be rather lengthy. But again, you don't want, say, the project leader to come down with a hammer, because if they do that too often, people will leave. So you need to tolerate. You need to tolerate lengthy discussions and hope that at the end everyone will be convinced, or at least remain friendly and supportive of the project because they've been taken serious, as opposed to they're just being told how the world is. So ideally there's consensus at the end. If there absolutely is no consensus to be had, people vote. It's a very idiosyncratic way of how decisions are made. Some votes are cast, typically, shall we do this, yes or no? So people will vote a +1 for agreement, or a 0 for withholding or withdrawal, and a -1 if they're dead set against it. Now, if in such a vote there is a minus, while there is no veto right, it might still be considered a veto, because again, you really want consensus. So you'll dig into why is someone so dead set that they're not just silent, but rather explicitly argue this is not a good idea. Anyway, ultimately a decision has to be made, and the way it's made is, as mentioned before, by writing a summary email that goes that is sent out to the mailing lists, where it can be read widely, and will also be archived so that in the future you can reference that email on the mailing list archive for everyone to see. So let's take a look here at some numbers, an illustration really of some numbers. In a well-working open source project, for every committer, there may well be 10 to 100 contributors. And also for each committer, there may easily be 10,000s of users. So you can see how these are orders of magnitudes differences between committers or project leaders, contributors or developers, and actual users. Hence, deciding how to spend time to acquire volunteers is not easy. What if you're spending time on the wrong people and it never pans out? So you have to think about this as you go about it. And the thing to realize is that time is your scarcest resource, and that recruiting will take away from that time that you could otherwise spend on developing the software. So the best way, and this is how Vogel casts it, is to view recruiting as an investment. It's your time, your investment. And so you've got to critically observe it. You make incremental moves and you watch and review the feedback or the reactions you get, and based on that you incrementally steer whether you invest more time. You've got to be open and welcoming in the beginning, but you should not be spending extra time unless you see how that person is willing to engage. And willing and helpful here means that they read up on how you tell them that they should be engaging with the project. If they just stumble into the forums, ask questions in a poor way, which shows that they haven't read up on anything, it suggests that they're not particularly reliable and probably not that interested in the project if they didn't even spend that little time figuring out how it works. And hence, you might just limit whatever time you're spending on these guys. So view recruiting as an investment of your time and work with it. So then any volunteer who's long enough worked with the project will have loyalty to that project, has that investment in the project, and may ultimately, and certainly that way has at its heart the interests of the project, and may ultimately become a project leader themselves. That's the step from a contributor to a committer. And as a leader of the project, they really need to show that by taking responsibility. And that really, like leadership typically is social work of sorts. So they need to, if they hadn't done that before, really be praising other people, providing positive social feedback, really making helping the community feel whole and the people welcome within that community. The leaders here not only praise, they acknowledge, they provide credit, etc. They may even go outside the project to say, provide positive feedback about a developer to their manager within companies, if that person is working on the project on company time. Or simply provide simple tokens of appreciation. It's amazing how far t-shirts, for example, can go to keep people motivated and contributing. Finally, these 5 stages of engagement that we are discussing are some sort of basic career, but then there's also the more elaborate career that I mentioned before that, within the community and within a foundation. A project leader will make that very explicit, will give people terminology on what to talk about, the roles they have, the career stages they are in, etc. And the critical part here of a project leader's work is, of course, to determine whether the promotion of a regular contributor to a project leader or committer is warranted. And that is one of the few things that may not be done in public because it's so socially sensitive. If someone's accepted for a committer position, then of course the existing project leaders will have to make that very clear, announce it visibly, and welcome that person to the ranks of committer for their well done continued contributions to the project. All right. So we are not going to watch it in this lecture, but there is a very nice video out there on dealing with difficult people and open source projects called Dealing with Poisonous People, because the wrong people in your project might really poison it and not only waste your time but really ruin the project if they are smart and divisive. Whatever might be driving them. You don't have to assume that there's deliberate mischief at work. They are just not a good match and thereby may be poisonous to the project. So the wrong people may be wasting your time but might even split the project if not stopped. So this particular video suggests the 4-step process. First, you need to understand the where poisonous people come from and then identify them. Since the best defense is being prepared, you need to have your community, if you will, be healthy, so that there is no leverage point for anyone who deliberately or not deliberately might want to harm the community. So building a healthy community is the main preparatory measure and something you want to do anyway, so that goes hand in hand nicely. Part of that is, again, public, written, archived, complete and archived communication, where all the decisions are being documented. So leaving no room for conspiracy theories. So, but let's assume that now is a difficult person or a poisonous person. How do you detect them? Well, simple things give them away, like they don't show respect. They don't actually read up on how the project wants people to behave, because that's their community rules and guidelines. Because they're clueless, because they're overly emotional, etc. They make sweeping claims. There are probably lots of ways of how you recognize someone. Doesn't necessarily have to be a moron, but simply will be a difficult person in this project, in this context. So dealing with them now is a well-worn way of doing it. We've all, or certainly open source project, have their share of experiences with trolls, which is to not feed them. They're an energy beast in the words of the video. Don't feed the troll. Don't give them energy by responding to them. They will then silently go away if you ignore them. If they absolutely don't leave and somehow are able to engage people and trigger people's hot buttons so that those people do respond and feed them, well, apparently sometimes you can't help it, but you have to boot them, which means you just remove them from the mailing lists and block them from disturbing the project communication and collaboration. All right, so I walked you through these 5 stages of open source volunteering, where the volunteer, initially a seeker, visitor, potential user, volunteer, and project leader, really, engages with the project and how the project needs to match the interests of the volunteer by marketing, explaining the project, engaging with the volunteer, working with them, and enabling a career for them. So that's that for this session. We looked at open source projects and community open source projects in general, the project roles that people have, and the career stages that are available to members of open source projects, and then the 3-4-5 model of open project communities, consisting of the 3 principles of open collaboration, 4 practices of open communication, and 5 stages of open source volunteering. That's it from me for now. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'll see you in the next session.